So hello everybody, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all, depending on where you're joining us from. And to all of you, a very warm welcome to the second webinar in our series of events focusing on key issues ahead of WRC-23. Today, the issue that we're going to be focusing on is the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz frequency band, and asking how the needs of all the key users in that band can be balanced. Now, we have an excellent lineup of speakers with us who are going to be discussing those issues. We have different industry stakeholders from across different groups, and also regulators from all around the world. And in a second, I'm going to be passing to our moderator for the webinar, Jeanette Stewart from Analysys Mason, who is going to be introducing the speakers and running the webinar for the duration of the event. But just before I did want to just mention a couple of things myself. First of all, I wanted to say a very big thank you to all of our sponsor and partner organizations for the event. I've mentioned Analysys Mason, so our partner organization, Analysys Mason, I'd like to thank Jeanette and her colleagues for their support with the event. And all of our other partners and supporting companies and organizations that you can see listed on the slide next to me here. As ever, without all of you, the event would not be possible, so we really do appreciate all of your support. I just also wanted to very quickly recap for everybody the backgrounds to these series of webinars. So at all of our events that took place last year, the regional conferences that took place last year as part of the Global Spectrum series, we asked people, we asked all the attendees what they expected to be the most prominent issue at WRC-23. And there were three key issues that came up, with the 3.3, 3.8, which we're looking at today, the 6 gigahertz band, and the UHF band. And that's why we came up with the idea of having a series of events, series of webinars looking at these three issues. So a separate webinar looking at each of those. Now, we've already had the UHF webinar, which actually took place last month. And you can see here some of the speakers we had at the event there. If you did miss that and wanted to go back and recap on that, then the replay of that event is available to watch on the website at the bottom there, spectrum-series.com/webinar. So you can go back and watch that. But today, as I said, we're going to be shifting the focus to the second one of those issues, and we're going to be looking at the 3.3 gigahertz to 3.8 gigahertz band and balancing the needs of all the key users in that band, basically. And the schedule that we have a busy schedule over the next two and a quarter hours or so. So first of all, Jeanette's going to be setting the scene and maybe outlining some of the key issues that we're going to be covering in the event. Before we then hear from the ITU, so we have Philippe Aubeneau from the ITU with us, who's going to be giving us an opening presentation and just letting us know the latest updates from the ITU perspective of where we are focusing on this key band. We're then going to be moving and hearing from our different industry speakers on their positions, their thoughts, and then following that with a response from all of our regulatory speakers. So listening to the perspectives we have from the industry stakeholders, setting out their positions and giving their thoughts and their reaction to that. We then bring in all of our speakers back together for an interactive discussion before we come to you guys, and we're going to be addressing the questions that come from you from the floor. So we do please encourage you to use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen to post any questions that you have, any comments, and we will pass those across to our speakers, and those will be addressed towards the end of the session. So, as I say, a busy couple of hours ahead of us. So without further ado, I would like to now welcome to the stage Jeanette Stewart from Analysys Mason. So Jeanette, welcome. As I said, we're really looking forward to the discussions, and I'd like to now pass over to you to introduce things. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I would also like to extend my welcome to everybody joining this webinar, which is one in 3 of the WRC-23 series, as Dan has described. So I'm Jeanette Stewart, and I work in the Spectrum Consulting team in Analysys Mason. We are global telecoms, media, and technology consulting and research firm, and we've been working with Forum Global on this WRC-23 webinar series. So the topic of the webinar, as Dan has described, is the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz band, often also referred to as C-band. What we will go on to discuss in the remainder of this webinar is the agenda items concerning use of this band that are being studied within the ITUR ahead of the World Radio Communications Conference, which is taking place in 2023. So I'm going to say a few words of context on the band, and then I will pass over to panelists to discuss the details of the WRC agenda items and the different industry perspectives on priorities that lie within this range of spectrum. So moving on to the next slide, please. As you'll see on the slide here, apologies, the detail is quite small perhaps on your slide, but the primary allocations in this band are radio location, which is in the lower part of the band below 3.4 gigahertz, and then we have fixed satellite and mobile services thereafter. These allocations have been used commercially in different markets for different commercial uses. So they have been used to provide fixed links, to provide satellite downlinks, fixed wireless access in some markets using either WiMAX or LTE, and also more recently mobile. With respect to the mobile allocations, these mobile allocations have come into use in recent years for IMT systems or 5G. For 5G specifically, there are also some provisions with conditions attached in the radio regulations via footnotes, and these footnotes list the countries that are opting into these provisions in different regions, and that mainly relates to the 3.3 to 3.4 gigahertz part of the band. So current situation in terms of allocations is reasonably varied across the three regions. The extent and characteristics of the existing use then also varies by country, which means that the approaches that regulators have taken to facilitate new uses such as 5G have also varied by country. But generally speaking, what you can see from the slide here is that the fixed satellite service satellite downlinks are used most extensively in the upper part of the band, whereas military and radar systems are operating mainly in the lower part, and then the middle part is where we're starting to see new uses and 5G. If we go on to the next slide, please. So what is becoming apparent is that many countries have already assigned 300 megahertz or more of spectrum in the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz band recently for 5G networks. Additional assignments are already planned for 2021 and 2022. Broadly speaking, European regulators are making 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz available, and there's a European harmonization decision on that part of the band, whilst in other countries and regions, portions of the spectrum between 3.3 and 3.8 gigahertz are being made available. Decisions being taken in different markets to license 5G have been informed by the sharing studies and the provisions in the radio regulations, which have been put into place at previous World Radio Communication conferences. For 5G equipment, what we're seeing is that 3GPP has defined various bands to cater for the different allocations across this frequency range in different ITU regions. So in the latest specifications, we've got 3GPP band 77, which supports the entire 3.3 up to 4.2 gigahertz range, and then you've got band N78 covering specifically 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz, which is subject of today's webinar. Since the last World Radio Communications Conference, which happened in 2019, there has now been more deployment experience of 5G using different parts of the C-band. And what we can also see is that demand for using this band in future for 5G is not just coming from mobile operators deploying 5G mobile broadband systems, but also there's a more recent emergence of 5G networks for specific industrial uses or 5G private networks, for which spectrum has also been set aside in some markets also using this frequency range. So going into the World Radio Communications Conference in 2023, what we can see is an increasing 5G deployment within the C-band across countries in the three ITU regions. At the same time, though, there are other markets in the three regions where 5G is not yet on the horizon and where other systems use the C-band. And also where other generations of mobile technology, 2G and 3G, are still prevalent, and the focus is on expanding 4G, which uses other frequency bands not in the C-band. So there is a varying range of different perspectives across the three regions, which we will be exploring more in the webinar over the next couple of hours. I'm now going to hand over to our panelists who will be presenting further context, first of all, on the WRC-23 considerations, and we'll then be running through the different industry perspectives and regulatory considerations relating to future use of this frequency band. So we're going to hear first of all from the Councillor for ITUR Study Group 1 and also the Conference Preparatory Meeting, who's from the ITU Radio Communications Bureau. So I would like to introduce Mr. Philippe Aubignot. Philippe, over to you. Look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janet, and good day to everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon here in Geneva. So I would like to thank you very much, the organizer, for offering us the opportunity to present briefly today some background information and other ongoing activities on the ITUR preparatory studies for the consideration of the frequency band 3.3/3.4 GHz and 3.6/3.8 GHz at WRC-23. And the next slide, please. On this busy slide, I'm sorry for that, I would like to show you the place of the WRC agenda items dealing with these bands, 3.3/3.4, 3.6/3.8, among the many topics that we have on the WRC agenda. As you can see, these bands will mainly be addressed under agenda items 1.2 and 1.3 related to the mobile and IMT, but also under agenda item 1.18 dealing with narrowband systems in the mobile satellite service. The next slide, please. The scope of agenda items 1.2 and 1.3, which are further detailed in the associated WRC-19 resolutions 245 and 246, respectively, determine where will be addressed the bands 3.3/3.4 and 3.6/3.8. As such, the band 3.3/3.4 GHz will be addressed under agenda item 1.2, but only for region 2 and for relevant part of region 1. We are talking in the resolution of amendment to the footnote in region 1. This band is therefore not on the WRC-23 agenda for region 3. Likewise, the band 3.6/3.8 GHz will be addressed under agenda item 1.2 for region 2, but under agenda item 1.3 for region 1. Again, this band is not on the WRC-23 agenda for region 3. The other interesting aspects are that the agenda item 1.2 will consider both the identification of bands for the mobile service and the identification for IMT, while agenda item 1.3 will consider only a primary allocation for the mobile service. A lot can be said on the background information which supported the inclusion at WRC-19 of both agenda items on the WRC-23 agenda. In order to keep this presentation short, I would like just to refer you to the quotations included on this slide from both resolutions, which stress on the one side the importance of the mid-band spectrum to provide the IMT a better balance for meeting needs for both coverage and capacity, and on another side, the importance of the C-band for the operation of FSS systems, especially for countries in tropical area. The next slide, please. One way to understand the issue at stake is to look again at the international table of frequency allocation. Janet has shown already this information in a more elegant way, but here I would like to emphasize on the existing situation and highlight that both bands are already allocated to the mobile service on a primary basis in some countries in both regions 1 and 3. In some of those countries, the bands are also identified for IMT under certain conditions, which include the elements summarized on this slide. It is worth noting that these conditions were developed based on the studies carried out prior to WRC-07 and WRC-15, which assumed at that time the technology available. Of course, one of the purposes of the ITUR preparatory studies for WRC-23 would be to reassess the situation based on the latest technology available. Next slide, please. So in the previous slide, I referred to the studies carried out prior to WRC-07 and WRC-15. But here on this slide, it is interesting to note that during WRC-19, new countries from region 2 were added to the relevant RR footnotes on IMT identification in the bands 3.3/3.4 and 3.6/3.8 GHz. In other words, this may be seen as a confirmation of the trends toward the use of this band by the IMT. The next slide, please. The previous slide on the table of frequency allocations indicated also the radio communication services to be considered in the ITUR preparatory studies. On this line, you can find the relevant ITUR working parties which are in charge of these radio communication services and which are thus involved in the studies as responsible or contributing groups. In addition to relevant working parties, we have those from ITUR Study Group 3 dealing with radio wave propagation that are also contributing to the studies. Information on the technical characteristics, operational parameters, and protection criteria are currently being developed by these groups, contributing groups and responsible groups, and those from the contributing groups, in other words, the existing services, should be provided to the responsible groups before 23 July this year. You can see also on this slide the need to take into account the studies on WRC-23 agenda item 118 with respect to the possible MSS narrowband systems that are targeting the upper and lower 15 megahertz of the band 3334 in region 2. Next slide, please. To conclude this overview of the current situation within ITU, I would like to summarize the main next steps of the ITUR preparatory studies for WRC-23 on this topic. I would stress here the possibility for all stakeholders, members of ITUR, to contribute to the studies. And this includes not only the regulators, but also all the industries, operators, and even also some academia can contribute at the level of the working party. This is to provide, in particular, the system characteristics and requirements, which will be used to carry out the technical compatibility and sharing studies in the coming months and next year. As a result of these studies, draft regulatory solutions should be developed to satisfy the WRC-23 agenda items 1, 2, and 1, 3. The technical studies should then be completed to the extent possible prior to the Radio Communication Assembly 2023, which will be held during the fourth quarter of 2023, just prior to WRC-23 itself. So with that, I would like simply to add that we have a number of other slides in this presentation you may consult offline, which provide additional information of our future plans. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Jeanette, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, Dan. Yes.
Okay, no.
Thank you very much, Philippe. That was very helpful to put into context what the WRC-23 will study and also the requirements for those studies. So thank you again. We're now going to move on to the State Your Case part of the agenda. So in this part of the agenda, we will hear an outline of the different industry positions relating to future use of the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz band. So kicking off this part of the agenda, I'd like to introduce Ross Bateson, who is the Special Government Advisor for the GSM Association. Hi, Ross, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good day to everybody. Thanks to Dan and his team for organising the event, and Janet for hosting us today. And thank you all for coming to listen. Much appreciated. Today we want to explain the prospect that the 3.5 gigahertz range has for improving communications infrastructure affordably. In a 5G era, that's not just about mobile communications, but through FWA, the ability to provide fiber-like connectivity without the need for fixed infrastructure. So how do we make 5G mass market and available to all? In short, how do we make 5G the new GSM? Next slide, please. The GSMA is first and foremost an association of mobile operators, and as such, we're acutely aware of the role affordability plays in driving up the use of broadband. We've recently begun a new campaign to address those in the world who are unconnected. The campaign highlights how, of the 4 billion unconnected people in the world, the vast majority are within mobile coverage. There are several reasons for this, but cost is a big one. Next slide, please. Citywide mid-band spectrum like the 3.5 gigahertz range is being discussed at WRC-23. and this represents an opportunity to expand digital inclusion. We've discussed with all of you the benefits that 5G can bring in terms of education, employment, health, other issues. With these benefits comes a risk that people without access to these services become increasingly marginalized. This means that all of us have a responsibility to ensure that 5G is for all. The decisions made on 3.5 GHz are a big part of this. The 3.5 GHz range is the 5G launch band in most countries. The way that we assign spectrum will impact how these services are used. Widening channel sizes saves cost. Let me be very clear, this is fact. Lower channel size means greater densification and higher costs, also fact. Getting the spectrum allocations right is a driver of making 5G more affordable, fact. Next slide, please. The GSMA, we've covered, I think, the disparity between ITU identifications and real-world plans in a lot in recent years. I'm not going to focus on that today, but I want to look at what the reality is, which is shown in this slide. Everyone knows Europe and North America have signed a lot of 3.5 GHz spectrum. However, the really important thing to note is that they are far from alone. Look at Latin America, for example, and you see very clear plans from Peru, Colombia, Chile. Many people remember Brazil as being a strong supporter of IMT, only in 3.4 to 3.6 at WRC-15. Now in Brazil, satellite services are being moved to higher bands, and support for IMT up to 3.8 GHz is clear. Look at Vietnam, some of the other Southeast Asian countries with wider assignment plans. At the same time, I have to say the number of satellite operators still talking up the development of the band below 3.8 GHz for FSS is remarkably small. Fill rates are less than robust in a lot of cases, and CFOs really need to look at their regulatory teams and say, our customers and our investors are telling us that this is not the future. Why? Firstly, because higher frequency, higher bandwidth options exist. If satellite wants to be part of the 5G experience, it can't rely on 3.5 GHz frequencies. Secondly, because ACM, AIS, QoS, traffic prioritization, etc., are overcoming legacy rain and fade issues. We only need to look at weather trends next to this map to see that rain fade is being overcome. There's more rain in Copenhagen than in Kigali. Tokyo has the equivalent rainfall of Nairobi and Mombasa combined. Ho Chi Minh City has double the rainfall of Dar es Salaam. These urban areas will need 5G FWA, and modern technology makes this an achievable goal. The map also highlights where the discussion on these agenda items is taking place. In reality, in Region 2, there are a couple of countries that have strong support for continued FSS, Mexico and Argentina especially. In Region 1, Agenda Item 1.3 only supports decisions that have already been made in the case of Europe and ASMG, while Russian government use means support is as unlikely as ever. The question then falls to whether or not this is a band that Africa wants to use, and if so, how do we achieve that? In our studies, the need for more FWA in Africa than elsewhere gives them the highest spectrum demand in some places. Next slide. I also have to say these two agenda items represent a failure to focus on future needs in 2015. Partly a failure by the mobile industry to paint a sufficiently clear picture of the impact spectrum assignments have on affordable communications. It was a passionate affair, and in 2023, we have to make sure that this time we focus on the specifics of what is required and plan for the future. We will have new studies, and modernizing the systems being discussed will certainly be beneficial. Ultimately, though, as we have seen before, these will be used politically to come to the conclusions that countries want them to. I don't think anyone will have the energy to go there again, especially as, for reasons best known to others, we're studying IMT systems in one agenda item and working party, and systems that will look a lot like IMT, but are called mobile as an entirely separate issue. There are certainly those that believe that this is duplicated time. These studies will be modernized, but ultimately for this band, they will say things that we already know. With a little coordination, countries can make their own national choice as to what is best for them. Final slide, please. So there are a lot of decisions to be made. Ultimately, the WRC process we are going through will give regulators up-to-date sharing studies using AAS 5G-like systems, whether that's done under 1.2 or 1.3. No doubt they will demonstrate the greater spectral efficiency that 5G networks bring and improve coexistence options. The studies will be clear and will make life easier. 5G is more efficient. However, they're not going to magically say the opposite of what they said before. If regulators are hoping to look at the studies for this band and have a totally new solution, they'll be disappointed. The studies on 3.3 to 3.8 will support how you implement the national decisions that you make, but ultimately, those decisions will have to be made if you want to develop 5G affordably. The question that needs asking then is, are you happy? Are your consumers happy with the status quo, or do you want development? Do you want change? It's over 15 years since we started talking about this band at the ITU. That's the entire lifetime of a satellite, more than an equipment cycle for antennas. If you do want change, then we need to have a long-term conversation about how to make it come about. The countries that stand to benefit the most are often those that have the longest lead times in developing new technologies, and regulatory roadmaps need to look at long-term planning. The mobile allocation, or the IMT identification, is a major part of getting that process in motion. If you want change, the time has come to support it at WRC-23. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross, for that perspective. We're now going to move on to hear a perspective from the satellite industry. So I would like to introduce Mohanad Jawad, who is Senior Manager for Spectrum Policy at Intelsat. Over to you, Mohanad.
Greetings to everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I'm here to represent Intelsat. We've just heard from the mobile industry about the mid-bands. Obviously, there are 2 sides to every coin, and I'm here to represent the satellite industry's views. Next slide, please. When we talk about 5G spectrum, we're always focusing on C-band. In fact, WRC after WRC, we have focused a lot on this band, and it seems now we have reached an impasse where fundamentally, when you go above 3.6 gigahertz, the global situation becomes fragmented. Therefore, we cannot have a wholesale approach beyond 3.6 gigahertz. We need to have a balanced way of thinking when looking at spectrum bands. For example, sub 1 gigahertz, i.e. the 700 megahertz, have accounted for 20% of mobile operators using the spectrum today. Then when we have the mid-bands, the 2.5 or the 3.5 gigahertz range, where today mobile base station towers can cover several miles and provide throughputs up to 900 megabits per second. And what about the high millimeter wave bands? Well, today a single 5G in cities providing ad hoc capacity demand, while the suburban and rural footprint can rely on coverage spectrum below 1 gigahertz. And there are examples of MNOs doing exactly that in the slides presented here. So a balanced approach is needed to cater for wide geographical areas and ultra high speed capacity with low latencies. And regulators can now assign millimeter wave spectrum, knowing full well that there is an ecosystem in place. But governments and regulators must also ensure their priorities when meeting their mobile broadband policy is above revenue maximization when awarding new frequencies. Success isn't just about allocating new spectrum bands. Next slide, please. It's also important for regulators to be aware that for the foreseeable future, the dominant mobile technology isn't going to be 5G. And this is according to GSMA even own research. We heard the hype of 5G, but the reality tells a different story. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 4G amounts to only 11% of all connections, while 2G still amounts to almost 45% of all connections. Similar story in Latin America, 4G amounts to only 50% of all connections. So adding more spectrum bands is not the answer to the mobile challenges facing sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. In order to bridge the digital divide, regulators need to cater for a balanced approach, one that takes care of all technologies and allows them to grow to meet the 21st century connection challenge. Next slide, please. This cannot be better presented than when you compare the situation of the FSS usage across the different regions of the world. This has created, for example, the need for Europe to consider C-band for 5G, correct, but primarily because today FSS has limited use in Europe. to only B2B type services. Next, please. In other words, these are large teleports in well-known locations and can be protected. Next, please. However, the same cannot be said for Africa or Latin America, which relies on C-band usage for ubiquitous terminals, mostly in unknown locations, and therefore developing mitigation measures to protect these terminals is impossible. So one size does not fit all. All regions are different and regulators need to be mindful of this. Next slide, please. And this notion that every MNO needs 100 megahertz really needs to be challenged, because it has been used as a pretext to seek more and more spectrum in bands which remain to this day extensively used by FSS services. Furthermore, when we look at the spectrum proceedings and auctions from across the globe, we don't see MNOs rushing to acquire 100 megahertz. Sure, it is desirable to have, but as evidence show, it is not necessary. For example, Vodafone in the UK has launched 5G with just 50 megahertz. Countries across the world who have 4 MNOs do not acquire 400 megahertz, and so on. And we can see these in the examples here. India, one of the largest populated countries in the world, has only allocated 200 megahertz, and they have 4 MNOs. And there are other examples in Asia, Europe, and in the Americas. Next slide, please. When it comes to Africa, evidence has shown that the total IG mobile bandwidth available is about 1,372 megahertz, of which 1,080 megahertz is harmonized for IMT today, but only 477 megahertz has been licensed so far, which leaves 50% of spectrum still available. And a similar case can be said for Latin America, which has 60% of all spectrum available to be licensed for IMT. Ofcom study has also debunked the notion that 5G needs 100 megahertz per MNO, as it shows you can achieve 770 megabits per second with just 40 megahertz, and it's non-contiguous megahertz. Next slide, please. With all this said, we come to the conclusion that when it comes to WRC Agenda Item 1.2 and 1.3, mobile connectivity challenges in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa are not caused by spectrum shortage. It is infrastructure, affordability, and coverage. I say this with the backdrop that satellite continues to provide critical services that cannot be provided by other means, and it would be welfare destruction to accommodate IMT in the mid-band when 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz remains largely unused to this day. Therefore, we advocate for a no-change position until WRC-23 as the only sensible approach. And before people accuse us of blocking progress or preventing 5G, aside from the simple fact that Intelsat is working in 3GPP to enable satellite in 5G, I would like to add that there are alternatives such as refarming 2G and 3G spectrum. Dynamic spectrum sharing allows mobile operators to use the same spectrum band for different radio technologies such as 4G and 5G. Spectrum sharing among MNOs leads to higher efficiency and lower OPEX. 16 mobile operators in 10 countries have launched 5G using DSS technology, and also using millimeter waves in high-density areas. In cities across Europe, North America, and China are already starting to deploy this to provide a cost-effective solution for 5G. So there are alternatives to achieve a win-win approach and deploy 5G services. Final slide, please. But if administrations are still considering to go above 3.6 to maybe 3.7, as we've been hearing, then the right mitigation measures need to be in place, since mobile signals can interfere with FSS in 2 fundamental ways. 1, they saturate the LNB of the earth station, and 2, the out-of-band emissions of the mobile signal can cause in-band interference to FSS. To manage this interference, FSS receivers require from the regulators 3 policy issues. 1, next slide, please. Earth stations to be fitted with a bandpass filter. Next slide, please. And in imposing a guard band between the FSS and the mobile signal, because the filter simply cannot operate without a bandwidth to transition its operation. Next slide, please. And adopting the right out-of-band limits on mobile transmissions to ensure the protection of the FSS in the adjacent bands. So with that, I conclude my opening remarks, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for those remarks, Mohammed. So we're now going to switch back to the mobile industry's perspective, and I would like to hand over to Alessandro Casagni, who is the mid-band global lead for the Global Suppliers Association. So Alessandro, over to you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Hello to everyone. It's a great pleasure for me and for the GSA to be expressing our views on this very important band and those very important agenda items in WRC-23. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I would like also to thank Mahed for his very interesting presentation. I will not have time now to replicate, to express some observations on things that have been said, but I'm sure that during the Q&A we can address those items. So this is really, the 3.3, 3.8 is clearly the most deployed spectrum range for 5G networks so far. And this has to do with physics. It has to do with the fact that this is the 3.3, 3.8, and in general, the mid-bands have a unique characteristic, which has to do with physics, which has to do with the possibility to provide a good balance between coverage and capacity. And this was also part of the messages that we heard from Philippe. And then it also allows to have good outdoor to indoor penetration, thanks to the deployment of performing macro base stations. So operators, of course, are aware of these advantages of mid-bands, and in particular 3.3, 3.8, and are therefore investing in base stations in this frequency band because they want to achieve cost-effective, and cost-effective is really key, as also Ross has highlighted. For example, high-speed citywide continuous coverage to enable advanced consumers use cases which are emerging, but also to enable the smart cities of the future. And this frequency range is also key to provide, Ross underlined this also, fiber-like fixed wireless access service, which could be in cities, outside cities, depending on the availability of fixed broadband. So what is the result? The result is that there are now 264 operators which have acquired spectrum in C-band. 105 operators have already deployed or are in the process of deploying networks, 5G networks using the bands N77 and N78 that Jeanette has already described. And then there are already 628 5G devices on the market. And this represents 21% compared to what we had 3 months ago. If we could go to the next one, please, Jeanette, or that. Okay, let's go back to the issue of the contiguous channels. And here I think we need to have a deeper conversation during the Q&A maybe. Yes, the availability of contiguous wide channels is really very, very important for a number of reasons that I try to summarize here. A base station with a wide channel is there not to address the needs for one single user, but to address the needs of many hundreds of users that are present around the base station, and also the growing ecosystem of things which are around the end users themselves. Having a wide channel allows greater spectrum efficiency due to the smaller overhead compared to aggregation of non-contiguous channels in the same band, or also even in different bands. And this certainly gives a higher throughput, higher average throughput in the cell, and also leads to clear benefits in terms of power consumption on the UE side. Having a larger channel allows flexibility in deciding the best trade-off between bandwidth variability and latency, which allows to address ultra-reliable new use cases, emerging use cases. And then the last but not least key issue is cost. Having a wide channel clearly allows to have lower cost per transmitted bit. This has to do with the fact that the same base station can address a larger number of users, which means that in a capacity-driven case, and this is the case in cities, you will be able to deploy fewer base stations. Ross has some figures on this in particular. And then having a wide channel also allows the operator to address 100 megahertz with one radio. If the channels are instead separated and too far away from each other, the operator will need to deploy 2 radios, and the capacity is going to increase. So the result is that administrations are investing efforts to defragment spectrum so that wider contiguous channels can be made available, and we appreciate that very much. And operators are investing significant resources to actually acquire 80 megahertz contiguous spectrum. And I guess we need to have a discussion on this during the Q&A with our colleagues from the satellite industry. Then you can see there are some reports where you can find more information, and also an ECC report from CPT, which is also articulating some of these issues that I have been describing in this slide. If we could go to the next slide, please. Talking about sharing with FSS, trying to make things simple in a quick presentation like this one, we can see 4 cases. The first one is where you have earth stations and known locations, and these are in rural areas. Considering that 5G will mostly be deployed in urban areas, then coexistence can be achieved through what we could call restriction zones. If these earth stations in rural areas are ubiquitous, then we could think of buffer zones, separating the urban area with 5G and then the rural area with the fixed with FSS. In these cases, there are studies that have been carried out already in the past in the ITU, and new studies are now being carried out to account for the latest parameters for IMT and in particular AAS beamforming. But what we want to underline is that at the end, of course, as we know, at deployment stage, we will need to have some case-by-case detailed analysis beyond the paper studies that tend to be conservative. The third case is when you have FSS earth stations at known locations, but they are in urban areas. You can still have sharing with IMT, but in this case, there will be some impacts on 5G, so there is a need to have cost-benefit analysis. If you have ubiquitous deployment of FSS in the cities, then there is a need for a cost-benefit analysis at national level to decide how to proceed. If you want to enable 5G, maybe there will be a need to consider moving the FSS to a portion, the higher part, for example, of the 3.3, 3.4.2 range, or also to higher frequency bands. And this is an economic, but also a vision issue, as Ross has also mentioned. Going to the last slide, please. The recommendations from GSA. First of all, we noticed that in relation to 3.3, 3.4, studies have been conducted in WRC-19, and I think these studies can provide good confidence to deploy IMT. There are commercially available equipment also for the 3.3, 3.4, both base stations and UEs, of course, and we recommend administrations to consider amending the footnote and to add names of countries to that footnote. In terms of 3.6, 3.8, there are studies are being updated. Mobile primary allocation allows flexibility to administrations to decide among authorizing mobile services, maintaining FSS in parts of the band, or also the sharing scenarios that I've been describing earlier. So for our region 1 administrations, we are recommending to consider the upgrade to the mobile primary allocations, but it is really key to make sure that this is not going to lead to further constraints relative to the existing regulations, and also with reference to CPT, with respect to the CPT framework, which is described in decision 1106. CPT framework can actually also represent a valuable reference for region 1. Going to region 2 administrations, we suggest to invest in studies and consider the IMT identification and release spectrum, the 3.3, 3.8 in the short, medium term. What we are saying is that there is now a gap between the radio regulations and the reality of IMT networks, IMT 2020 networks, and we think that the WRC-23 can really give a good opportunity to reduce that gap and make things more aligned. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. So we're now going to move on to the final panelist in this session on industry perspectives. We're going to go back to satellite perspectives. I would like to introduce Gerhard Petrick, who's Deputy Chair of the Southern African Digital Broadcasting Association. So hello, Gerhard, over to you.
Thank you, Janet, and colleagues, thank you for this opportunity. As you mentioned, I'm speaking on behalf of a voluntary industry association. We can go to the next slide. We've been active in both terrestrial and satellite broadcasting and supported the region and broadcasters in the region and ancillary satellite industries. C-band as fixed satellite service is really relied upon in the region for a number of key services. I'm listing a few for you on this slide. We rely on C-band to connect air traffic navigation services, both the data part but also the voice part. Really important contribution to your safety of life service. C-band FSS services are also used to support satellite services. We geographically located in a place where we support new space vehicles being launched, in-orbit testing, and of course orbit transfer into orbital geostationary positions. It's really an application where you can't have storm or rain or whatever else interfere with you when you need to talk to your space vehicle. C-band is also used for essential communication services. Some of the applications include banking, mining, oil and gas exploration, communication to foreign missions, and of course backhaul for GSM and ISP traffic and disaster relief. A key role is also fulfilled through FSS C-band services in broadcasting, both in contributing services to multiplex hubs from studios or international feeds, and then distribution into terrestrial networks. And of course, also the applications of multi-destination news feeds that are important for the region. Next slide, please. So what makes C-band unique? We've already heard rain fade. Don't need to speak much about that. But what we haven't heard about is the advantage of very large or continent-wide coverage, something that's really not available on other systems. The ability to uplink onto one transponder and achieve the same receive availability from Cape Town to Cairo and from East to West Africa. That is really important and used extensively in our C-band services on satellite are deployed in Africa. There are very limited alternatives that could offer that same type of service availability over that size of footprint and at that cost. There are no alternate FSS bands that have these characteristics that allow that power level to do continental-wide coverage and with that additional robustness. To some extent, C-band for FSS is a critical scarce natural resource that allows a very unique ecosystem to exist. It's not unlike a nature reserve. Next slide, please. So what's the problem or what's the challenge here in getting to coexistence or sharing? Well, it really relates to the disparity of the received power levels. And I've tried to intentionally use two pictures there to help make the point. Satellite signals have traveled from very far away to get to a receiver. Terrestrial IMT signals in comparison are dramatically higher in power, and they impact that satellite to receive LNB and system. It's much like trying to listen for a whisper from the back row at a rock concert and trying to compete with what you see in that picture. Next slide, please. I think we're going backwards. There we go. Thank you. So lots of studies have been done. We've also heard that mentioned from Ross and from Alessandro. And really the pictures in the previous slide make the point. It is quite difficult to achieve kind of sharing in the same band and in the same geographical area. That's not attainable. It's the whisper versus the rock concert sound system. Sharing becomes even more complex when we look at MIMO and beamforming that dynamically can change the characteristics of a base station. So, and of course, add to that mobile terminals that are not in one place all the time. So the mitigation of that interference becomes quite a challenge. Geographic exclusion zones don't really offer a solution for C-band hubs. These are located in built-up metropolitan areas. You know, banking services, essential communication services are where the people are. Broadcast sites are mixed. They are both in rural areas as well as in metropolitan areas. So the challenge is that IMT seeks to cover the same areas where these hubs are available. Of course, mitigation is possible across band edges, provided that we know what those edges are and that there's fixed clarity on them for the long term. And Mohammed spoke about what that means, what mechanisms can be pursued. Next slide, please. So we do see interference, and it has increased significantly over the recent years. In South Africa specifically, a moratorium has been imposed by the regulator on the band 3.6 to 3.8 because of interference, and no additional services are licensed at this moment. That interference impact continues and impacts services received and delivered at the moment. Next slide, please. So as we look at working on those sharing studies, we need to consider the unique requirements that prevail for C-band for FSS in Africa. This is referenced in the resolution that are basically informing our studies. Significant C-band capacity is available for IMT. And IMT has a portfolio of frequencies and bands that may be applied in serving the needs. We heard from Mohammed that some of the bands identified, only 50% is currently licensed. Such a portfolio of options is not available for high availability FSS. Fixed band edges between IMT and FSS are really important, and we can pursue mitigation and operational solutions in this band. We have to make sure we look at adjacent channel powers, and coordination throughout this process will be critical. Thank you, Janet. Back to you.
Thank you very much. So that completes our industry positions. I'm sure that the different industry participants may have some feedback and questions to each other. So I hope we will be able to address those once we have heard from the policymakers. So we're now going to move on to response from policymakers, and then we will bring the whole panels together for discussion thereafter. So first of all, on the policy side, could I welcome Eric Fournier, who's the Director for Spectrum Planning and International Affairs at the ANFR in France. Hello, Eric, over to you.
Hello, Jeanette. Good day to everyone, and thanks to Forum Europe for this opportunity to present the view of a European regulator on the C-band issue. Thanks also to the four panelists. That was a very interesting presentation. So from the European point of view, obviously, this frequency band 3.4, 3.8 GHz is a primary 5G band in Europe that was already concluded in 2016, and now most countries in Europe and in the European Union in particular have granted rights to mobile network operator in this frequency band. As mentioned by Gerard and by Mohamed, with only very few exceptions, there's no more Earth stations receiving in Europe in 3.4, 3.8. Which means that the co-channel sharing is effectively considered as very difficult, only for certain rural areas. For adjacent band interference, we have put in place some procedure that's working in France, for example, with Earth stations above 3.8 GHz. As far as the WRC-23 is concerned, obviously because of our situation, we support the primary mobile allocation in the frequency band 3.6, 3.8. It's mainly to have a balanced situation with neighboring countries which are still using FSS Earth stations to have the same right for mobile and Earth station at the border. It's something which is important for us. However, we also recognize that the demand for C-band for satellite is not the same in various parts of Region 1. In Africa in particular, we understand the issue of high rainfall in some part of the continent. So there would be certainly a need to continue to ensure the protection in neighboring countries of FSS in 3.6, 3.8 GHz. And basically, the best solution is certainly to reuse the same technical conditions as applicable today in 3.4, 3.6 GHz for the protection of FSS Earth station. We can use the same procedure, the same technical condition that should work well. And we also conscious that the, as reminded by Philippe Obino, that agenda item 1.3 is not for IMT identification, only for primary mobile allocation. Now speaking about 3.3, 3.4 GHz, that's not really about FSSO station, that's about radio location, I say, the alternative to IMT. As a matter of fact, European countries in general have massive use of this band by radio location, and it's not only in the European territories, it's also in international waters aboard ships in particular. And just one example, we have some international operation in the Gulf of Guinea, which operation against piracy, which are using some ships operating this kind of radar. So it's something which is not only in the European areas, it's also in the African areas. There was some work in the last few years in ITU. There was a report M2481 which was adopted in particular with the contributions from African Telecom Union, and Daniel will certainly speak about this, which is describing the difficulty both for neighboring countries' operation of radio location in case neighboring to a country operating IMT, and also for radar operation in international waters. And the conclusion of this report is really that there's something like 200 kilometer, 400 kilometer interfering distance for the protection of radar. So that's something which is not making IMT operation in this frequency band easy in both directions, protection of IMT and protection of radars. So in this respect, what we would like at WRC-23 is keeping the same condition as what we have now in 5.429B and in the other footnote, with non-interference basis and non-protection basis, limiting the use to countries south of 30° north, and ensuring that in case you have a neighboring countries operating radar, there's a need for having agreement before operating IMT. So with that, we would have something which could work in 3.3.4. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. So now moving on, could I introduce Jose Aguilar, who's the Director General for Policy and Regulation and Communications at the Ministry of Transport and Communications in Peru. So good morning, Jose, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Janet. Thank you for Global for this invitation. Since Peru, well, since MTC, we are working very hard to actualize the legal framework. So in the last year, we have developed new regulatory tools and that allow the identification and assignment of the radio spectrum. So, for example, one thing what we did in 2018, our national frequency plan, we modified that, and this allow the foundations of the refarming for the spectrum and the reservation of the frequency bands in very important bands like 2.3, 2.5, and also 3.5. So, because we are in this moment, we are beginning to think about 5G. So, after that, we developed a legal framework very hard in spectrum management about regulation of refarming, also rules for efficient spectrum efficient use, and also to develop a secondary market for use of spectrum. And like Ross and Alessandro said previously, Peru has been promoting the identification of the ODC band from 3.3 until 3.8 gigahertz for MIT 2020. No? So we developed that in the meetings of CITEL and also in the last World Radio Conference. So and in Peru we have I don't know the problem in other countries, but in Peru, for example, the principal use of this band from 3.4 until 3.6, it was previously assigned to old technology like WiMAX. So we need to actualize it to actually that. So now we have the identification and location for IMT service, the ODC band from 3.3 and 3.8, and also the channeling of AWS, and also it was achieved. So for trying to use the C-band, in the last year we began a refarming. But just before the COVID in Peru, like in March last year, we have concluded that because we received the recommendation of the regulator of telecommunications, OCTEL, to do the refarming in the auction at the same time, like we can see in other countries. But we need to use the band because, like I said previously, for NEOs have each one 50 megahertz also. So we did a little change in the national frequency allocation plan, and we allow that these mobile operators can change the use of the band. So now, for example, in the last month, in March, 2 operators have been authorized for MTC to begin to offer commercial plan for fixed wireless access on 5G. And recently, we authorized 3 mobile operators to begin to offer mobile service in 5G. So yes, we are now using the band. We have 2 enterprise with commercial plans. And also in November the last year, we did a publication of 1 working paper, which proposed allocation of 3.5 GHz and 26 GHz frequency bands, and identification of 6 GHz frequency band for development of 5G and beyond digital service and technology. It was a technical document. We received a lot of suggestions, and with that we began to work in another ways, and you use that to allow the authorization for this enterprise. So I also want to say that we need also the spectrum, but we need also to have a very good regulatory framework for develop infrastructure, because without that we can have all the spectrum, but without infrastructure the user can use that. So it is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose, and good to hear those exciting developments then in Peru. Could I now hand over to our third speaker, is Daniel Obam, who's Communications Secretary for the National Communications Secretariat in Kenya. Welcome, Daniel, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Janet, and the speakers before me, Philippe, Rose, Mohamed, Alessandro, Gerhard, Eric, and Jose. And of course, to all the participants who have woken up early, stayed up late, taken time from their work to listen to us. As somebody who works for government, I want first of all to say that we are still debating these issues even in our own national preparatory process. And therefore, some of the issues that I'm going to talk about here are just my thoughts on this issue, and these are thoughts that, of course, I present to our national preparatory process. But before I go on, perhaps one thing that I would like to say for myself, that sometimes as an African, some of us feel really uncomfortable when we listen to people grouping us together as one small country. The fact that only 50% of IMT spectrum is unlicensed doesn't apply to all African countries. The deployment of FSS differs from country to country, and therefore, for me, I would rather I spoke for my country and not be lumped in a group of countries. Having said that, just to try and address the issue of considering the use by all key users of this band. So my suggestion would be to maybe segment the band If you get 3.3, 3.4, this has already been was already used by many African countries for fixed wireless access, WiMAX, and even for mobile since 2007. And footnote 5.429A, there are 27 African countries, by they spread across West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, Northern Africa. So all the countries, 27 countries, have signed a footnote for mobile, to allocate this to mobile. In addition, 5.429B, 23 African countries, again spread across the continent, have identified this band for IMT. Therefore, for that band, 3.3 to 3.4, already there's momentum, and perhaps what I would like to suggest as a way forward is that other Region 1 countries, as per the agenda for WRC-23, or specifically African countries, should join this footnote so that we can have this band used. And in doing so also, we need to push for relaxation of these stringent conditions that were imposed by these footnotes and Resolution 223. So that would give us 100 megahertz to be used in this band. Now on 3.6 to 3.8, and I think when we are presenting any data, it should be we should be able to restrict to deployment of FSS, especially in 3.6 to 3.8. My proposal, which is based on what we did with ATU in 2015, is that we break this into two parts: 3.6, 3.7, 3.7, 3.8. Study how the use of this band is with regard to FSS. In 2015, what we did, ATU studied the use of 3.4 to 3.6, and the results were that actually there wasn't a lot of FSS use, and that's how we agreed to upgrade the allocation in the radio regulations from a footnote to a full allocation. So if we can do the same for 3.6 to 3.7 and 3.7, 3.8, and perhaps at this point I would urge, if it is possible, for the mobile industry and the satellite industry to maybe work together and carry out studies on the extent of usage of this band. And then based on the results of this usage, we can end up with either another 200 megahertz or 100 megahertz or no spectrum for us to make a decision. And I say this because for people who work for government, I'll tell you, for Kenya, the mobile has changed our economy in the last 20 years. But we also have critical services that rely on satellite. And therefore, we're like a parent who has a tall child and a short child, and each comes with their requirements. Say for clothes, you cannot go for one and leave the other. You have to listen to both, and within your means, you see how best you can be able to accommodate them. Therefore, we urge that studies be carried out, and I think the two industries, either together or separately, can contribute to this, so that we see the extent to which these bands are being used by FSS, and therefore we reap the benefits of IMT. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So our final speaker is Mr. Tariq Al-Awadi, who's the chairman of the Regional Preparatory Group for WRC-23 in the UAE from the Arab Spectrum Management Group. So Tariq, over to you.
Thank you, Janet. First of all, I would like to thank from Global Dan and his team for organizing this webinar, excellent webinar. It is my pleasure to be here, and thanks to all previous speakers. It was interesting to hear from them about this important subject. I was trying to say something else, but after listening to all previous speakers, especially from the operators, I'd like to mention one thing, that you know that all the spectrum is a scarce national resource, and it is sovereignty right for any countries to manage and to regulate the usage of the spectrum, which suit their requirements, their needs, and how to bring the new technologies. And of course, they will be aligned with the radio regulation, ITU radio regulation, to protect the neighboring countries. For that reason, ASMG Group also had a lot of meetings, discussion going on for preparation for WRCs since beginning. And in 2001, this ASMG has been established as officially under Arab League. And since that time, we are participating in ITU, submitting our proposal in order to use this frequency or the spectrums for efficiently for all kinds of services. Now, coming back to this band, in 2017, Arab Group has studied on which frequency that to be bring it very quick for 5G services technology. So we saw the 3.3 to 3.8 and 3.4 to 3.6. It is already more primary, but 3.6 to 3.8 in region 1, it is secondary. So we have decided altogether as to use this band for mobile service as a primary, and of course protecting the other services. In that case, from that time, many Arab countries, I can tell you right now, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, I think maybe Egypt also, some other countries, they already deployed 5G commercially between 3.4 to 3.8. And this is for the reason, one of the reasons that we have submitted as a proposal last WRC to add one agenda item to elevate the 3.6.3.8 to primary location. Of course, it would be good to use it for IMT. And that's the reason for using this one to use it in accordance with the rate regulation. Now, if we will always keep saying that frequency band, it is not being used a lot by countries for mobile operators, similar things we can do it for other services, either satellite or broadcasting for other bands, of course. If we'll go to do studies and we will see it, there are many countries not using this band for satellite. Let me tell you right now, in UAE or some other Arab countries here, the C band and this band, 3.4 to 3.8, right now, fixed satellite service is not available. It is being asked them to shift it to the other band from 3.8 to 4.2, for example, for the VSAT or other services. Similar has been done for some other countries. Now, we have, for example, one station, a Thuraya station, using for the gateway. So we are putting some mitigation technique to protect it. So our comments also have to be very careful that if we will not see the country's need, at least each individual countries, and to give them a right to use the spectrum wherever that to be used and protecting other services, then we will see a lot of countries or regional groups to go away from radio regulation. And that is what we don't like it. We need to all to be in line with radio regulation. But because the technologies right now, it is moving very fast, and even we need to see from regulatory side worldwide how to adopt these new technologies with their countries, and of course with international organization or like ITU or regulation. Now in WRC-23, we are supporting this band or this agenda item 1.2 and 1.3 for the bands there. And Arab Group, it is already submitting their proposal to the study group on working on how to protect the other services and to using this band for mobile. Similar we are doing for 3.3 to 3.4 for using it. So thank you very much. I just only want to say that we have to see the needs of each country and how to use the spectrum. Spectrum, it is scarce resources for the country, and they have the right to use it for any service that you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Just while Forum Global organises the panelists and brings everybody back onto the screen, I would just like to say thank you very much for those useful comments from everybody. I'm sure there are lots of questions from the webinar audience, but I would like, first of all, perhaps to give all of you the chance to respond to some of the things that you have heard from each other. So could I start, first of all, with the four industry speakers? Excuse me, there's a slight echo on your line. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'd like to first perhaps ask Ross and Alessandro. for their comments on what they heard from Mohanad and from Gerhard. So perhaps some of the key takeaways I heard from Mohanad and Gerhard. So for example, Mohanad mentioned there are other bands available for mobile. Why is the C-band so important? Some mobile spectrum is allocated in other bands but not used. There was some question, I think, from Mohanad about the amount of spectrum needed in C-band, the 100 megahertz, and also the need for contiguous spectrum. And then finally, I think Gerhard made the point that there are limited alternatives to C-band for satellite to get the same sort of continental footprint that there is currently at that same cost point. So Ross and Alessandro, do you want to perhaps give me some perspectives on those key points? So Alessandro, maybe starting with you.
Sure. Yes, here I am. Maybe I could start from the more high-level concept expressed by Mohanad, and which is the availability of other frequency bands, alternative maybe, in other frequency ranges. What I would like to say is that really mid-bands are quite unique in, as I said, the possibility to provide balanced coverage and capacity. And the C-band in particular is also unique within the mid-bands because it can allow providing wide channels with those characteristics. And this is really key. What I would like to say is that the low frequency bands are very important as well, and the high frequency bands are also very important. Deployments of operators, as you can see globally, are leveraging on low, mid, and high bands, and this is going to be more and more true as we go across the years. And the low bands are good for wide area coverage and deep indoor coverage, but they are not able to provide enough throughput for the users that you would find in a densely populated city. And the high bands can provide very high throughput, and they are excellent, but they will be economically more problematic if we are thinking of the need to provide continuous coverage throughout the whole city, to provide a consistent user experience for people that move around the city. The other comment that was made by Mohanad was about spectrum sharing between our mobile operators. Of course, this is really, really key. And I think the evolution of mobile technology is giving us operators in particular, a great opportunity to smoothly transition from one technology to another. And we are certainly great proponents of technology neutral frameworks in Europe and in the different regions globally for all the bands, low, mid, and high. And high bands, but there are some limitations on what you can do in a 5 megahertz or 10 megahertz or 15 megahertz LTE channel, for example, in 1.8 gigahertz. Yes, you can, and this is happening. Operators are doing it. You can switch on smoothly 5 GNR on top of the LTE 1.8, but the throughput that you get cannot be anywhere near what you can get with 100 megahertz contiguous channel in the C-band. And I'll stop here for now, leaving maybe Ross the opportunity to comment on other aspects.
Yeah, Ross, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for the great presentations while I'm here as well. Much appreciated and really good to have this debate. Look, a couple of things to pick up on. One of these was from Mohanad's presentation about the European picture. Look, there's a couple of places there where perhaps it's important to give a really up-to-date picture of what's gone on, especially in the UK. We've had a recent auction that's very specifically designed to make sure that there's sufficient channel bandwidth in 3.5 gigahertz. It was done in two halves in the UK, this assignment of spectrum. We've just had the second half. The case in point that was given, I think, was Vodafone. They now have 90 megahertz of spectrum. They'll need to see about trading that to make it contiguous, but that's got the channel that's agreed on. You know, another example given was Italy. Italy was a very, very specific case of the value being shown of wider channel bandwidth. It was an auction that was designed to make two operators win and two less so. And two of them got 80 megahertz of bandwidth, and this came at a huge premium, and two got much less. The value shown in that Italian auction is probably one of the biggest examples of how this value is at the operator level. But as I said, I don't really want to talk about Europe that much. There's been European regulation for ages talking about this 80 to 100 megahertz in the band, and I think everyone knows that pretty well. It's what's happening elsewhere that's really important. When you look at countries like, we heard from Peru and Brazil. Brazil will be, going through its auction, launching what's probably going to be over 100 megahertz per operator. And it's these moves in other markets that I think are most worthy of note at the moment, beyond decisions like the European one, the ASMG one from 2 years ago. I think there was a discussion about sort of carrier aggregation and why can't we, aggregate our channels a bit better. Yeah, that's always an option, but ideally for a number of reasons we're looking at contiguous, and that's why a bunch of regulations from all around the world are looking at either assigning contiguous spectrum or allowing people to trade a little bit afterwards to allow for contiguous. It increases efficiency in a number of ways, but also lowers handset complexity. And this is going to be really important when we go into the emerging markets. Cheaper handsets, one, but also stuff like battery life will be improved. And this is another important factor in some parts of the world. Finally, I think why 3.5 gigahertz is important. Well, it's been a case of, it's an ideal mixture of coverage and capacity, but it's also a question of build it and they will come. This is where everybody has gone, and this means most affordable equipment, most diverse ecosystem, and everything else. And this is why it's really considered as the 5G launch band. So I do have a couple of questions for the satellite industry, and maybe I've spoken enough, but I think just one for Gerhard before, as he's about to speak, would be these sound like really important services that are being provided in your presentation, and I do agree that obviously these need to be supported, but I'm not quite clear what the problem is with the spectrum between 3.8 and 4.2, and B, in a modern day with modern satellite systems, what the problem is with a lot of these services in higher bands, especially in the video content distribution business. We're talking about airport installations. True, these exist, but these take generally very small amounts of C-band bandwidth. We can shuffle things to make a better win-win situation for the socio-economic benefit of everybody. And I think I've spoken enough, so I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. So can I maybe ask Gerhard to respond to Ross's point, and then we'll come back to Mohammed. I think you had some points, in response.
Thanks, Janet, and Alessandra and Ross. Thanks. The point is to have this debate, and I really am enjoying it. I must say, as always, Daniel Obam gave a very good guidance on what we should be doing, and I think that is really important too. We need to understand the needs, study them properly, and then plan the way forward. I think very important is there's no intent to say we want back 3.3 to wherever, 3.6 or whatever. There's very clear understanding of the importance of IMT, also from satellite users and from the broadcast industry. So definitely the approach that Mr. Obama outlined is really relevant. We're just raising our hands saying that this band has a unique capability that's not available in any other satellite band on this type of power level, on the dish size you need, and giving you availability in dry areas as well as in rain impacted areas across a large market. Really important for us. I guess if you look at all these things, the measures we've spoken about, the possibility of coexistence, fitting filters and doing all those things, it is partly one of the areas that's frustrating us as users, because we're experiencing interference in bands that should still be, at this stage, allocated as primary use to satellite services. And the interference arises unannounced, and it's at times is very difficult to seek regulatory support in mitigating it. And so I guess when we're talking about all the great things we can do in sharing and in working out what we could do across band edges, having filters fitted, ensuring that out-of-band levels are suitable, that needs to be enforced to make it work. I somehow, in preparing for this, I came across this a Big Yellow Taxi song. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. Counting Crows just recently recorded. It comes back from the 70s. And it's got this line that says, pave paradise, put up a parking lot. And the chorus goes, you won't know what you have till it's gone. And I think that's partly the message I'm saying. To us, this portion of C-band that remains is like a portion, or like an reserve. And I'm not saying that satellite services are endangered species and need a nature reserve. I'm just saying this is a unique ecosystem in the world that we believe is justified in use and needs to find a place where it can exist. It provides services that are not possible in another way. And I'm just saying, let's not wonder about it after it's gone. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerhard. Mohammed, on that point, I wondered if you wanted to maybe respond on what Ross and Alessandro had said. I picked up from both of their presentations that there are higher frequency band options available for fixed satellite services, and I think both Ross and Alessandro, and perhaps some of the regulators too, made the point that the sort of direction of change has been evident for some years, given that this topic has been discussed at previous WRCs and that satellite can't rely on the 3.5 gigahertz band into the longer term. So, Mahan, there's quite a lot for you to respond to there. Over to you.
Thank you, Janet, and I hope you can give me some time to respond. So, just quickly on Alessandro's very valid remarks. Yes, we appreciate that C-band is unique in terms of its characteristics. And as Gerhard mentioned, this characteristic has been actually used extensively for the satellite community for over 40 years now. So whilst we appreciate that from the mobile perspective, this is unique, but it's already been uniquely deployed at the satellite industry. And that's why we're calling for a balanced approach. This balanced approach is needed because you already have 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz that's available. There are sub 1 gigahertz bands that's available. There are, I can't remember how many, over 22 gigahertz available in the millimeter waves. So there's plenty of spectrum that's available. It's welfare destruction if you are going to go for the direct bands, which are uniquely suited for areas in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And in regards to the coverage ability, I think the sub 1 gigahertz is uniquely suitable to provide that coverage, coupled with the capacity needs, rightly mentioned by Alessandro, for high density capacity areas such as stadiums or urbanized cities. And what's interesting is when we look at the ITU sharing studies, in particularly in Working Party 5D, I have actually noted that when it comes to the studies, the mobile industry is actually shying away to do studies in urban or suburban areas. They're only focusing on studying in urbanized areas. In other words, it's like they want to use this band only in cities and urbanized environment. And I think that does a disservice to the populations around the world, especially when we're talking about bridging the digital divide. And in terms of throughput, just to Alessandro's point, I mean, please have a look at the study that's been done by Ofcom after they've auctioned the spectrum, after MNOs have actually operated that spectrum. They've cited, and I quote here, 770 megabits per second in the download speed and 440 megabits per second in the upload speeds with just 40 megahertz of non-contiguous spectrum, 40. And to address Ross's points about Vodafone, I mean, I just go back to Vodafone's press release, and I'm looking at their website right now where they're saying that they're deploying with 50 megahertz 5G enabled gigabit speeds and low latency, et cetera, et cetera. So you can have a look at their websites to verify that. In regards to Italy, I can cite India, China, Brazil, I mean, all these countries have a very dense urban environment and a high population density. And I haven't seen any of them going above 3.7 gigahertz. So to Daniel's point, maybe there is a compromise to be struck. Maybe there is a way to find a win-win to look at the first 100 megahertz when it comes to the gender item 1.2 and 1.3, as opposed to the entire range. Maybe that's the way to go, because certainly the evidence show that a lot of these countries have actually gone up to 3.7. And I'm actually curious to note Ross's remarks to the presentation by Gerhard, that maybe there's a win-win to refarming spectrum. And I think that might be a good way to go about things as well, to efficiently use the spectrum. And as opposed to the comments by Alessandro about mitigation measures, what we've done is actually worked with countries in Africa and other parts of the world where we've done a study to show what separation distance are needed when it comes to in-band studies or co-frequency mitigation measures. And the separation distance are huge. We're talking about 50, 70, all the way to 100 kilometers. So it will mean it's unfeasible to have both technologies coexisting at the same co-frequency. And that's a big challenge for regulators to complement. So I really welcome some of the remarks by Daniel that looking at first 100 megahertz or trying to actually establish where the foothold is for the efficient amount of spectrum that's needed, a balanced approach, I think is the way to go. So I hope I've addressed some of the comments that were raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Daniel, do you want to just confirm what you said? I think what you were referring to was a study approach where perhaps the industry participants should conduct a survey into the use of the bands, but that survey should be split into two portions, 3.6 to 3.7 and 3.7 to 3.8. Do you want to say?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jeanette. And by the way, my comment was informed by your slide, the slide that you shared on how the band has been used. If you look at the lower part, 33 to 34, there were two countries that have already assigned it to IMT. But if you go to 3638, they are split into two parts. There's a difference. Most of the usage is concentrated on 36 to 37, but there's some of it already in 3738. So that's what informed my proposal. And I'm not saying there's a limitation, but I was saying maybe we break it down, because GSMA is telling us you need 100 megahertz. So why don't we do these studies in 100 megahertz bit? But it's a study over the whole band. And then that informs our decision as we go forward. What I'm seeing here is perhaps the focus is on us as maybe Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. So perhaps we need to really inform, maybe we may inform how this decision will be made. So we need to have a very serious discussions among us as African countries and see on which side our bread is buttered. And that's the side that we want to push forward for WRC-23. Maybe it's buttered on both sides. So I think that we'll be able to submit to the conference when the time comes for that submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Ross, just coming back to you, did you have anything to say on that suggestion?
Sorry. Yeah, I think it's very important that we look at, take a holistic view about what's needed. And I think we need to very clearly study what current use is, what the socioeconomic benefit of these different options is as well. And that's something that we obviously do during the WRC cycle. We are at the moment trying to show spectrum demand as much as possible. We'll be going deeper into socioeconomic benefits at a later stage and trying to understand better. And there will be more and more research coming out over the next year or so regarding these issues. But yeah, I mean, it is an interesting point how much FSS usage there is in different parts of the band, and that's something that we need to understand very, very, very clearly. and what the benefits are of having 5G in the band over that FSS usage.
Thank you very much. So I think maybe perhaps before we delve into specifics of the different portions, we might sort of look at 3.3.3.4 and then 3.6.3.8. I just wanted to maybe just stay at the macro level first of all and get some perspectives from some of the other panelists. So just opening up now to the regulators. You've heard these Q&As here. Anything else you want to ask the panelists while you have them all available?
If I may, on one point, the title of the webinar was "Balancing the Needs of Key Users in the 3.5 GHz C-band," and the key users which are on the panel are from FSS and IMT side. And satellite community, IMT community is sweet to my ear, but there's one missing player here, which is radio location and governmental use. And that's something which is important. We have also to balance with the need of radio location. I understood the points from Daniel, but very clearly fixed wireless access is not, say, as disruptive or as problematic as 5G. And there are some operation in international waters which are making things complicated. So I fully understand that we will need a lot of discussions on that in preparation of WRC-23, but there are another key user here, which is for radio location.
Thank you, Eric. Daniel, I wondered, do you want to respond to Eric on that point, just specifically about the 3.3 to 3.4? And perhaps you and Eric in your presentations gave different perspectives on this.
Yeah, thank you. My perspective is the fact that already 23 countries have identified this for IMT. And as I mentioned, if you go to the footnote 5.429, you will see how the spread of the countries are. So it's across the whole continent. So that's the basis for our argument that actually this band already, African countries are looking at it for IMT, and we should go ahead on that. Already there are a lot of restrictive, the footnote gives a lot of restrictions on how you can use it for IMT. So perhaps if I may say that worst case scenarios, we use it with those restrictions, but then it will not serve any purpose. So we need to ease these restrictions, and we have not, in the country where I live, we've not deployed radio location, and that's the basis on which I'm making my submission. But on a general point, I think we need to have this discussion, especially to the key users, and I do take Eric's point that radio location, which is a primary user here, is being pushed to the back, and we're only looking at satellite and mobile. Perhaps these are a unique opportunity for the two sectors to work together and provide us very specific results based on each country on how this band is being used by each of those services, so that we can make an informed decision at the conference in 2023. Thank you.
Eric, back to you. Do you think that's a fruitful discussion then to perhaps clarify how this band is being used and where it's being used?
Well, I think for the time being, the use is remaining limited, and there are some conditions which are in footnote 5.429b, which are helping making the situation easy. But even in France, we have experience in past use of the 3.4, 3.5 GHz by radars in some ships in the Mediterranean area. And at that time, we have some fixed wireless access in the south of France, and we really experienced difficulty. So even if it's not exactly the same frequency band, we know that the sharing is not so easy. So we should not put too much expectation on this 3.3.3.4, even if the FSS community would be happy to have 3.3.3.4 use instead of 3.6.3.8. There are also some difficulties here. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you. Tarek, I wonder if I could turn to you, please. There was a question from Ross, I think, which was about the ASMG decision on 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz and whether this has caused any cross-border interference issues. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, thank you very much. With regard to cross-border interference, if you're talking about between Arab countries, no, we don't have raised any issues. Similar thing again with regard to the neighboring countries, other than that ASMG group, no, we don't have received any kind. Maybe, but there is an interference within the same system on the bordering areas because of using TDD technologies and need to have synchronization, especially at the border areas, which we already experienced this now between countries, especially in GCC, the country, UAE, Oman, and some others. And we are coordinating for how to use that one. But with other services, no, we don't have received any kind of interference.
Okay, Ross, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I think that's part of the discussion is obviously how to look after the concerns if one country wants to make one decision and one wants to make another, and how we look at this as a national decision-making process, and we're using the ITU to give us robust guidelines about how to make national decisions, and I think that's an important part of this decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Jose, I wondered if we could just turn to you and hear your reactions to what you've been hearing in this discussion.
Thank you, thank you, Janet. I think it's very interesting because in Peru, when we have a public consultation about to identify all the range from 3.3 until 3.8, yeah, the mobile sector say, okay, it's very good, but the satellite sector say, no, wait, it's dangerous because maybe in the last range, 3.8, maybe we can have interference. So we discussed it very hard, and we asked information, for example, and it was 2019, and well, after 2 years, we don't have any information. So I'm sure that, for example, in Peru, we don't have problems in the final part of the range, but because the principal issues of the satellite was are in the KU and KA band. No? So, for example, for me, it's very interesting of the discussion, but I think in Peru it is solved. We don't have a major problem about that.
So, Jose, just to confirm, I think there was a question actually from Mohamed, which was where does Peru and sort of also across Latin America see the cutoff in terms of where you would deploy 5G? So, for example, we understand that Brazil is using spectrum up to 3.7 gigahertz only for 5G.
Yeah, well, we have identified from 3.3 until 3.8. Now we are currently deployed in 3.4 until 3.6 because there were a signal previously, and we are working in a new auction, a new award, and maybe we expect the next year, and in this award we will have at least 200 megahertz from 3.3, 3.4, and from 3.6 until 3.8.
Thank you. Mohamed, just coming back to you, firstly, just in case you want to respond on what Jose has said as well, but I wondered also if I could just ask you about something that Eric mentioned, which was about the primary mobile allocation in the 3.6 to 3.8. So Eric had mentioned that in Europe there have been, well, the primary allocation has meant that there's very few Earth stations still within parts of the band, so that the co-channel interference issue is not an issue. However, there are adjacent channel provisions in place, and that those same provisions that apply for 3.4 to 3.6 could apply for 3.6 to 3.8. Do you agree then that that is a possibility then, that those existing provisions can be crossed over into the 3.6 to 3.8?
Thanks, Janet. Just before I address Eric's question, maybe just to reply to Jose's remarks here. And it's interesting also from looking at across the panelists that, like I mentioned in our opening remarks, globally, when you go above 3.7 gigahertz, it's really where the picture becomes fragmented. Every region has a different dynamics, different usage and requirements to be dealt with, and regulators need to look at this very carefully. Tariq mentioned, for example, in the ASMG, they're going all the way to 3.8. There are dynamics there that simply do not exist in sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia or in Latin America. In Europe, as I mentioned, the usage, like Eric Fournier mentioned, is limited to business type of FSS usage. So the teleports are known in their regions, and the mitigation measures can be accomplished because these are large teleport earth stations, and normally they are in rural areas because they are teleport earth stations. And in some cases, actually, the geographical landscape helps shield them if you've done the due diligence right when you deploy these teleports. But when it comes to regions outside Europe, the situation is different. You have no need for a license in these terminals. These are TVROs in people's households, used extensively for providing millions of users in hundreds of TV channels across the globe, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So the mitigation measures to deploy separation distance, for example, like we have in some cases in Europe. By the way, in Europe, in many cases, we've been vacated. It's not a mitigation measure. It's basically put the boot on and kick the FSS out of the range. And that really, for us, it's not sustainable. We require long-term regulatory certainty. We want to know what is happening for at least 15 years in advance, because satellite range, as Ross mentioned, is 15 years and maybe more now with advancement in technologies. So it's not always factually right that in Europe there are mitigation measures. In some countries we've been vacated. But even if there are mitigation measures, the guard band, for example, in order to have filter rate, is not being imposed as a policy across Europe. And we're fighting right now in some countries to actually have this considered. So when we're looking at the WRC agenda items, particularly 1.2 and 1.3, if countries, and it's a big if, have decided that they want to go above a certain range, then need mitigation measures, as I mentioned, and we're happy to administrations and regulators to provide some of the lessons learned from our side as Intelsat and as an industry to ensure that a guard band is suitable and is as efficient as possible. We're very aware that spectrum is very important to make sure that we deploy guard band as possible in order to allow filters to operate so that it does not saturate and overwhelm the LMB threshold. Gerhard mentioned some of the examples they've discovered as well. So we need to make sure that mitigation measures are a consideration from the beginning, not an afterthought, as has happened, I would have to say, in Europe. Maybe Germany has been a good example where they have actually deployed mitigation measures from the beginning. France, I think, has considered as well. But we haven't seen that in many other countries in Europe. So we are very concerned the situation does not get replicated outside Europe. Hope that addresses the question.
Thank you. So, I mean, just before we come off this topic, I mean, have there been problems with IMT FSS interference in Europe or in other countries? I don't know if Eric or Tariq, in fact, might want to come back on that.
Yeah, maybe the experience that we have with our neighbors. We have Luxembourg, for example, is continuing to use FSS stations. And we have some coordination discussion with them, and there will be no difficulty to protect the continued use of zero stations in Luxembourg. I think Daniel was making the very important difference between, say, unlicensed FSSO stations or uncoordinated FSSO stations and coordinated FSSO stations. In Europe, there's only FSS coordinated Earth station and limited number, so it's always possible to find a solution in cross-border discussion. There's no difficulty and no interference here.
Yeah, if you allow me, Janet, I'll just comment here. As I mentioned, that we don't have that much FSS air station in this country. Thuraya, we do have it, yes, in UAE, and so that was already registered, and we had put some mitigation techniques and using the radio regulation in order to protect and asking also from neighboring countries. But at the same time, you can see in the UAE, we're already using this band in the UAE that we are using the full 400 megahertz from 3.4 to 3.8 for mobile. And we are having also fixed satellite services, air station, at the same time. I will not say that there was not experienced some interference. We did, but we did some kind of coordination between the two operators, the satellite operator, Thuraya, and the telecom operator. And we used that one, and now there is not much interference on this one. We put some protection for it. So in the Arab group, we do have very, very limited using the fixed air station. Now, if we'll go back to Visa, that is something else. We are asked all our operators. We do have also two operators, Thuraya only for gateway. So we don't have any problem. Yahsat, they are using for the VSAT. So Yahsat, we requested them to move their VSAT from 3.4 or 3, they are not in 3.4, 3.6 to 3.8 to 3.8 to 4.2. This is already has been done within the Arab countries, some countries, but in the UAE, I can give you, this is the example.
Thank you very much, Tariq. Well, we have several questions from the audience. Just before we move on to them, Alessandro, just coming back to you, did you want to respond on anything before we come to the audience questions?
Thank you, Janet. Yes, I would like to pick up a few issues that were risen and put them a bit together. First of all, a possible upgrade to primary mobile allocation from our perspective is something that can give simply opportunities, bigger choice. Opportunities, of course, to facilitate cross-border coordination, also opportunities for different usages to access the band with, let's say, balanced rights. The issue is, we think, is going to be, of course, in the hands of administrations once the mobile primary allocation is given, which is to find the right balance at national level. And we think that there are some very important elements that need to be considered at that stage, which were recalled during the discussions. One issue is the actual usage of the frequency bands. And I'm glad to say that in a few days, there will be a study that is going to be published, which is going to provide some evidence on the usage of the satellite, specifically in Africa, in the range that we are discussing today. Another important aspect is to better understand the needs and projecting these needs with a vision on the future. And here I can just underline two very simple statistical pieces of information, which is Nairobi, for example, or Lagos. These are cities where you can find an area of more than 800 square kilometers with a population density, which is about 27,000, 28,000, which is more than the mostly populated densely populated city in Europe, which is Paris. What kind of connectivity requirements are we going to see in these cities in the coming years, considering mobile broadband, but also at the same time also fixed wireless access, for example, depending on the availability of fiber connections to the home? I think these are, of course, the third element with the sharing studies. This is going to be very important for the decision making at WRC 23. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. So I'm now going to move to some questions that we've received from the audience. So first of all, Rafael Prada from Anatel in Brazil has asked, I think, Mohamed, this is a question for you. How is the coexistence experience being seen in Germany and Sweden, where there has been the decision to make spectrum available for private 5G networks in the 3.7 to 3.8 band? Are there interference cases reported in Intelsat Earth stations?
Thank you for the question. So I don't know about the case in Sweden. We don't have a teleport there, but we do have one of our largest teleports in Fuchstadt in Germany, southern Germany. It's a very nice area, a wine-growing area. If you have been to visit, it's very, very nice in the summer. Germany has made a very pragmatic approach, I would say, when it comes to Europe. They actually, if those who are not aware, deployed 3.4 all the way to 3.7, so 300 megahertz nationally, and left the upper 100 megahertz for localized usage based on the demand of the area. When it came to Fuchstadt, so that's the first thing, they didn't allocate the entire 400 megahertz for the whole country. And I think that's a prudent way of looking at the deployment of spectrum efficiently. And then when it came to teleport, they actually located where their teleports are. Like I mentioned, these are teleports, so they are registered, they are known, and they've taken a decision to protect these teleports. And we provided studies to show what separation distance is needed. And a lot of collaboration was done with the regulator to ensure that the sufficient separation distance is available for the teleport. And because of that, this allowed us to operate without any interference. So I think just to back up what Tariq mentioned, probably with Yahsat, they've done something similar where there was a separation distance in order to ensure that these teleports are protected. But when we're talking about smaller terminals, FSS ubiquitous terminals, separation distance of 50 kilometers for each terminal is just not going to be feasible for both industries, the mobile and the satellite. So to answer the question, yes, there has been good coordination with Germany, and the teleport is protected. But we do see, and I see the other questions, we have seen interference outside Europe, in Africa, where interference has been caused by deployment of 5G services here and there. And we're working with the regulator to ensure the proper mitigation measures are in place.
Thank you, Mohamed. And perhaps just staying with you, there's another question then about satellite protection criteria. So the question comes from Rakesh Maheshwar, who's a senior advisor in Samsung. So the question is, the satellite protection criteria was fixed 20 years back. Over the years, the payload and the antenna systems have improved. Is there a need to relook at these parameters? Can protection be achieved more efficiently?
Well, that's true. There has been a lot of innovation and a lot of advancement in technologies, but as Gerhard mentioned, you just can't get around physics. These signals are traveling 36,000 kilometers from a satellite. By the time they come to the LNB, LNA receivers, the signal is so weak compared to a power station that's on the Earth that it will simply saturate the LNB and it will drive it outside its linear stage. So the differentiation of ratio and power between a terrestrial base station and a satellite signal is vastly huge. And that's why either a separation distance is needed, or in some cases, you can mitigate it with filters. But the filter cannot operate without a frequency separation, in other words, a guard band, because you need to have that bandwidth to allow the filter to transition its operation from a linear stage. So yes, there has been improvement, but it still doesn't allow us to get around physics of the comparison between the two signals. And that's why the right mitigation measures have to be in place beforehand. And I might just add that when we're looking at guard band, it's not ideal to have the guard band on the FSS side. It has to be a balanced approach and as efficient as possible. So it must be guard band that's allowing the filters to operate. Another thing that we're looking at right now in terms of advancement in technologies is integrated LNAs and NNBs. So the filters will be integrated with one RF component. That's something that's that the terminal manufacturers are looking into as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Just Ross and Alessandro, just coming back to you, there seems to be a couple of questions just to clarify again the 100 megahertz bandwidth for 5G, and there was, I think, just some specific clarification about the UK situation. Ross, I know you already addressed this. The question was, is 50 megahertz sufficient per operator to launch 5G, and what is this UK example? So Ross, perhaps you want to just reiterate what you had said on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Janet, for that opportunity. And yeah, I think we need to put this one to bed because that's not an accurate picture and it's not factually correct. The auctions in the UK happened in two parts, 3.4 to 3.6 and 3.6 to 3.8, or those parts of it that became available in the second phase. And so a lot of the operators had smaller portions of spectrum to start off with. They now have, I believe, 90, 80, 80, and 120 or 140 megahertz of 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz spectrum. So each of them has this sufficient bandwidth now. There were some figures from Vodafone that UK used early on. And look, let's be clear. As of today, Vodafone has 20-odd million subscribers, of which about 1 million of them are 5G users. So none of these cells are very loaded at the moment. We're about 1 year or maybe a bit more, year and a half into 5G launches in the UK, and things are taking off, but they're still getting going. Crucially, we've only just had our 700 megahertz auction in the UK to provide a kind of more universal 5G experience. So the numbers are still reasonably low as a percentage, as I say, about 1 million for Vodafone 5G compared to, I think, 19 million or something like that, general connections. So, of course, with the light load on this cell, this was possible. But apart from the fact that saying that they've got these smaller tranches is not true, it's really important to note that, you know, some performance is possible with lower channels, but the affordability and densification of the network will only come with these wide contiguous blocks. And as we move into emerging market, and going back to the very first point I made today, we've got to think about that cost. We've got to keep the cost down. And if we make 5G expensive, then it's not going to serve its purpose to give universal broadband for all. Thanks.
Thank you, Ross. There's a couple of questions for Daniel, if I may. So, Daniel, perhaps could you just clarify what you said in your discussion about the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz band? Did you say that 100 megahertz of that had already been assigned for mobile, and does that therefore mean that the remaining 100 megahertz is available or used by the fixed satellite service, or is that not the case? And then there's a related question, which is about. In fact, I've just looked. Why don't you answer that question now, and I'll come back to the other one.
Sure, thanks, Janet. I did not say that we have split the 3.638 into 100 meg for MS and 100 for FSS. Our primary allocation stopped at 3.6. As we all know, that band is allocated to mobile on a secondary basis. And I've just checked when we were waiting with some of my colleagues, technical colleagues, and they confirmed that there is no allocation of the mobile service between 3.6 and 3.8. What we are saying is that since it's allocated mobile on a secondary basis, so we see if we can upgrade that to primary at WRC-23. And then maybe if it works out based on studies, then we can also identify it for IMT. I'll wait for the other question. Thank you.
Thank you. So the other question actually was from Eric Tejidor from Ericsson, and the question was, is the FSS in Africa mainly above 3.7 gigahertz?
Is that a question?
And that's why, Janet, thank you, Erickson. We are saying that, yeah, let's find out how it is, how the FSS distributed between 3.6 to 4.2, and specifically 3.6, 3.7, and 3.7, 3.8. Just quickly, when we did a study with Africa Telecom Union in 2015, we split the band into two, 3.4 to 3.6, and then 3.6 to 4.2. So that's a very large swath of spectrum. That's why this time maybe we need to do the same, but maybe look at this specifically 3.6 to 3.8. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
I think it does. Thank you. Anybody else want to say anything on that point? No?
From the satellite side, just to mention, we actually use below 3.7. So we actually deploy from 3.6, not as much as above 3.7, true, but there are deployments there, and I think Gerhard probably might allude to that as well. The problem with the surveys and questions, as Daniel mentioned, whilst they are a good, prudent thing to do, and the intention is well-meaning there, we've experienced that in the past, surveys do not always provide the most accurate picture because of lack of responses, but also because of the terminals are ubiquitous in nature and they're not licensed. In many ways, they do not require a license from the regulatory authority. So it's very hard to understand the true extent of that deployment. We are working very hard to try and rectify that. One look at this is to try and work with the customers and the regulators to help us understand the true extent of the usage. But I agree that this is a prudent way of doing things, to look at the usage and then determine a decision on a balanced approach from a regulatory point of view.
Thanks, Mohammed. Ross, did you want to come back on this one as well?
Yeah, I think there's just a couple of points to make there. And firstly, I certainly agree that we need to look very carefully about the different uses of this band. And it's true that, you know, obviously traditionally 3.4 to 3.7 was what the satellite operators used to call the extended C-band, and it's a slightly different category for them. It's not for us. For us, the band goes from 3.3 to 3.8 or 3.3 to 4.2, depending on which specification we're looking at. So there is a slight clash there. I'd also say, you know, apart from looking at the use, looking at the opportunity of finding other options is really, really important, both in terms of some of these installations that Mohammed was talking about. You know, how can these be moved higher up the 3.4 to 4.2 frequency range in terms of FSS? Will these all need retuning? Some of them won't. What capacity do the satellite operators have? How are their fill rates above 3.8 to 4.2? And what capacity do we have for creating a better situation? You know, there's been some good examples of this, again, going back to Brazil, and I know we have some people from Anatel on the call as well that can probably describe this better than me. Brazil, for example, they've just, you know, they have plans to reshuffle their TV receive only service that they offer in Brazil away from this band. They looked at filters. They actually developed their own filter along with some industry colleagues that provided a solution to free up an extra 100 megahertz through this filter. But then looking at the situation in more detail, they said, no, in fact, we're going to move this service to KU band. And that's the best option for our country. You know, this is Brazil, and I lived in Brazil for many years. When it rains there, it rains really quite significantly. So, you know, this is the kind of advantages that we're having from modern satellite technologies, which is a great help. Thanks.
Thanks, Ross. Tarek, I wondered if you wanted to say anything on this. And there's another question for you, which is, are you considering local licensing for IMT and C-band?
Well, thank you very much. I just want to comment before coming to that question. I was checking with some of my colleagues and operators saying about using less bandwidth for IMT. As Ross said, it will have big cost effective. So the studies have shown that just go from 100 megahertz to 60 megahertz, it may require 64% increasing the cell. So that will be cost effective for the operators if we go below 100 megahertz. Now, with regard to using the satellite band here, as I mentioned, and I was hearing also about there are some licensed or unlicensed. For the fixed satellite services, there are two types. Fixed air station, which should be coordinated, should be registered, and that will be protected. So in our region, there are not that much air station that we are having, except in UAE and some other countries maybe. Yes, we know that Qatar also, they are having new satellites coming, but also they are considering to see about moving to the other bands, because in the region right now, we are not using that much C-band. And we are requesting our satellite operator to move to the KU and KM band. With regard to the IMT C-band or licensing, local licensing, if you mean local licensing, not all over country, no, we are having here operators giving a license for all over UAE, and this is also happening in our neighboring countries. But also, because we are having one air station using C-band 34 to 36, we put some geographical sharing or some distance, as mentioned by Muhammad. That is the thing that we used, around 30 kilometers, if I'm not wrong. This is what we remember did the studies, to have distance separation in order to protect this fixed air station.
Thank you very much, Tariq. So I think we have a hard stop at 15 minutes past. So we've got time for very quick comments from everybody, starting Alessandro with you.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up again on what Mohammed has said on the usage. So, okay, questionnaires can be answered in different ways, fine. But I think that a very important mean that administrators may have to assess the usage of a frequency band is simply to measure what is with the spectrum analyzer, what is how much is the spectrum used. And I think that there is some activity ongoing on this, as I said. And then very respectfully, maybe once the usage of the FSS is known to a larger extent in the 3.4 to 3.8, maybe one option that administrations may consider with impact assessments, and that is certainly their responsibility, is to see if the usage of the satellite FSS can be moved above 3.8. So it could be moved above 3.7, or maybe with additional knowledge on the usage, we could also understand that maybe the current use can be also moved above 3.8. And it's not up to the GSA to say anything on this, but this is simply an option that maybe can be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. Gerhard, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just want to pick up on a comment made on the social value or the value to society of this band. And of course, yeah, no argument, IMT is really, really important. And I'm just highlighting the risk and the huge challenge for regulators to try and assess the value of C-band. First of all, many of the applications are multinational. So it is an intent of a bank that's active in multiple African countries to have accurate live banking data. It's very difficult to figure out how you put a value to that in terms of how that helps society. Because you could argue it's purely a commercial endeavor of one bank and not relevant to the rest of the continent. However, if you're a customer of that bank, the scenario changes dramatically. I'm also thinking about how do you assess the value of missing the World Cup winning goal because of a disruption on your transmission path. How do you put a value to that? We had a situation last week where a backhaul feed was severely disrupted. It impacted not the people in the country where the interference was, but it took out the national broadcaster of a neighboring country. So how do you put the value on not being able to watch the 8 o'clock news, something that's really important for in our region, in a situation where COVID prevails and you've got important announcements that your citizens need, and hundreds of thousands of homes are left without that service. So I think that's a big challenge. I really think it's very much like the value of a nature reserve. You cannot say that sustainable ecotourism is the reason to have a national park or a reserve. Yes, it helps it helps to create development opportunities and balance the needs of human development around the parks, and to be able to justify that you have a reserve. But it's not the reason, especially if we see now where tourism is dead. You need to have another more fundamental long-term view of actually sustaining an ecosystem that's important to you. So thanks, that's the comment I wanted to make.
Thank you. Mohammed?
Thanks, Janet. Well, my concluding remarks would be, as we've heard, there are different views. There's always two sides to the coin. Both industries have put their views across. All I ask is a balanced approach has to be taken to ensure that the technologies is enabling a holistic approach to bridge the digital divide. We're here to provide connectivity to citizens and benefit the communities across the world. One approach, one size does not fit every single region, has been argued. A harmonized approach, while it's desirable, cannot always be achieved. And when we're talking about vacating to higher bands, we simply cannot entertain that thought when we don't know what the scope of the challenge is. Because if you're going to be vacated above 3.8, what's to stop from tomorrow somebody saying, well, you have to vacate from 3.8 as well? We need to know what is the amount of spectrum that is needed to deploy 5G. We put our case across, but we still don't know this mystery about how much spectrum is really needed to deploy 5G. There are studies that show it's achievable with lower amounts, but we really need to know what is the true sense, and to stop coming at each WRC seeking more and more spectrum and undermining other technologies while doing so. So thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you. Ross, anything final from you?
Thanks. Yeah, I mentioned I was rather jealous earlier of Gerhard managing to bring a quote from the American singer Joni Mitchell in earlier. So I'm going to reply to Mohammed in a way and say that we need to look at life from both sides now. And as we look forward at this issue, the IMT sector is constantly providing spectrum demand models, and we're doing more and more throughout this cycle. What realistically we need to look at is what the current usage is by FSS, as mentioned by Mr. Obama, and how this can be more efficiently used in either the upper part of 3.8 to 4.2 or in other bands as we've looked at. What's stopping this? What are the fill rates on the satellite operators? Are they really, really high, or is there actually capacity to use this spectrum more efficiently? Who are the satellite operators realistically that are still have long-term plans below 3.8 gigahertz? Are people going to their investors and saying, hey, this spectrum at 3.6 to 3.8, I think it's a really great satellite band? And if they are, why are they doing that is an important question. So as we move forward, I think there is win-win situations, but we need to be realistic that this tranche of spectrum is really the launch band for 5G, and it's the most important band for regulators to consider when they're looking at developing their 5G networks. There's no way around that. This has already happened, and we've seen in the most highly industrialized markets, they're moving well beyond this WRC in their assignments. What we're asking for in this WRC is clarity at launch so we can make 5G affordable for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And finally, the regulators, Tarek, Eric, Daniel, anything final from you?
Yeah, allow me and just say thank you very much, first of all, to all of you. And it was happy to hear from all of this people here from operators or regulators. And this discussion will continue like that. And at the end, we have to see what is the best for each country to be used for their society, for their government, and for their own network. So it is a pleasure to be with you all here. I think this kind of discussion is good to have it more and more. And we understand right now where is the issues going on with either satellite operator or mobile operator. As a regulator, we would like to say that we'd like to bring what is the best for our country and to be used for our people. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
from my side, yes, I can only upload to what Tariq has said. We have to take into account the various and different needs of regulators in all parts of the world and in all parts of Region 1. We need something at the end which will be a balance, and once again, I would like to say that balance means also taking into account radio education and not only FSS and IMT. Thank you, and thanks to all.
And finally, Daniel.
Thank you. Yes, mine would be try to be as short as possible. Myself and my colleagues don't need convincing coming from Kenya the importance of mobile or satellite. Therefore, maybe the two industries should try and work with each other and convince each other the importance of their importance to one another. For us as government, we know the importance. So the next step perhaps is we need to look at this in a more collaborative manner, using 21st century models so that we can have coexistence. I think taking hard stance will not take us anywhere. Last but not least, I really wish to thank the moderator. We have one of the greatest moderators who has ever moderated a session, a great panel, and a great audience, good questions. I didn't expect anyone to ask me questions, but they did ask me some questions, and I hope I answered them. It was an honor to participate in this panel. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, or a good morning, or a good night.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand back to Dan.
Perfect, guys. Thank you all. I'd like to just add my thanks to everyone here for what really was a fascinating discussion, and really interesting discussion. And I think it's great having so many different perspectives there, and I think that's what really kind of gets the discussion going and things in that way. And I should say thank you as well to Jose, who did have to leave us just a couple of minutes ago. He had a hard stop, so he did have to leave us. And actually, I should say a particular thanks to Jose, because there's certain logistical challenges when organising global events in this way, which cover all regions. One of them is to do with time zones, and I think Jose got up at 5 o'clock to join the panel. So thank you to him for doing that, and thank you to all of our panelists, and of course Jeanette, to yourself for as Daniel said, fantastically moderating that session. So thank you all so much. And a thank you finally to all of you out there. I think we got around to answering most of the questions that were posted. There were a few that I think we weren't able to get to, so we will, if it's okay, pass those questions over to our speakers, and we'll allow our speakers to come back to you personally to answer any of the questions that we didn't get to. But thank you all so much for those questions. I think, as ever, it's great to have so many questions and discussion, and I saw there was a lively debate going on in the chat as well, so really appreciate that. So that's just about it. So before we go, I just wanted to remind you all of the third and final webinar that we have in this series. So we've focused on the UHF last month. Today, obviously, we focused on the C-band, the 3.3 to 3.8, and then we have our third webinar next month, which is going to be looking at another key issue, the 6 GHz band. And you can see we have an excellent lineup of speakers who are going to be discussing those issues in a similar format that we've used today. So please do join us for that. But all that's left for me to do is to once again say thank you very much to Jeanette and to all of our panelists. Thank you very much to all of you out there for your participation. Wishing everyone a very pleasant rest of the day, whether that be morning, afternoon, or evening. And we're looking forward to seeing you here again very soon. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.